Good morning, this is Denis Joannides and Stein Welberg from Onegini, and welcome by this webinar for fingerprint authentication. I see that a lot of entities drop in now, so I suggest we start the webinar. So what we will do today is have a brief introduction about Onegini for the one who don't know us yet. We focus on what kind of requirements do we have when you're implementing fingerprint authentication, and Stein will dig in much more deeper on how to implement and what kind of measures you would take to implement fingerprint on the device, and also how you get control on the fingerprint when it is being used. And we just touch FIDO briefly to get you an idea of what they are doing and how this can help in the future for supporting fingerprints on multiple devices. Briefly about Onegini, we are a software company, and we're providing software basically for enterprises, larger enterprises, smaller enterprises, to connect your end users to your backend systems and to expose personal online services. So that means that we provide mobile authentication, make sure that your personal data is protected, and at the same time we bring convenience, because especially when you start digitalizing your business, it's important that the end user has a lot of convenience for accessing the data. And that's the reason, for example, that a fingerprint is a nice feature for the end user to access their data in an authenticated way. Let me explain briefly our security platform, so you get an idea where we are and what we're doing. So as I said earlier, we connect the end user device basically to your enterprise to make sure that you know who is the person who's trying to access your personal data, and to make sure that the data is protected and you have end-to-end security from the device to the enterprise. We have several components for that. One of them is on the mobile part is the mobile SDK, which provides all kinds of functionalities such as enrollment, identity verification, mobile login, connection with payments, etc. So that's more for the end user experience. We also connect various authenticators. One of them is the fingerprints, which we dig in today, but also the PIN code, biometrics, or voice. And at the same time, you have to protect the app itself to make sure it's not jailbreaked. So you have to detect that it's hardened, and also to make sure that the data you store on the device is secure. At the enterprise level, we protect the access to your data services. So basically it's protecting the APIs and give you all the monitoring functions and controls and analytics to make sure that you are in control and can also take proper actions when you detect some abuse. There are other webinars which will go more in depth on the platform itself. So looking at the fingerprint, what are basically some requirements when implementing a fingerprint? It's not just adding the fingerprint to the mobile app itself. For example, you have to support multiple vendors. There's still difference in the vendors itself. So iPhone is popular and Samsung, as we all know, but there are a lot of others. And each of them have multiple OSs. And even there's a difference in the OS itself for a specific device and a specific Android version, for example. And implementing the fingerprint on the device itself is not enough. You should be able to configure it from the enterprise. So when the app is launched and is running, you still need to be able to control whether it should be enabled or not. And we say auditing. You always need to know whether the fingerprint is being used or the PIN code, or whether any other authenticator is being used on the device itself, to make sure at the enterprise level what kind of authorization you would like to give. And another requirement we have is that the fingerprint should be integrated in different processes on the device. For example, when somebody enrolls, How is it integrated? Are you going to allow the fingerprint to be used or when people log in? Or is it just being used for two-factor authentication? All these items should be implemented. And then once you have done that, you also have to manage the risk per device. And it means that once you see there is something not going well on the device, for example, when it's rooted, you should take proper actions. Are you going to allow the fingerprint on a rooted device, yes or no? That depends on, of course, the app itself, but you need to know it. And then it should be implemented and should be able to come together with the PIN code or the voice. So what are the preferences? Are you always needing a PIN code or not? We're saying basically a PIN code is always needed, but you can also go for a voice. So these are requirements you should take into account when implementing a fingerprint in general, so on the mobile device and also on the enterprise level. So just giving you some ideas about fingerprints and there are many more which already supports a fingerprint on the device itself. And some of them are generic, can be used because of Android, but some of them are more specific. And there are a lot of new devices popping up with fingerprint authentication. Even you see a lot of new devices getting biometrics, so iris scanning, biometrics, etc. So in the coming 1-2 years, there are a lot of different authenticated devices you would like to leverage and integrate. So I mentioned this as a requirement, but it's very important that as an enterprise you are in control and be flexible when to use the fingerprint. For example, when you as an enterprise launch multiple apps, maybe you would like in one app just having the PIN code, and especially for signing transactions. And in the other app, you allow to be used the fingerprint and a PIN code. But as I said, it's very important that you are in control, are flexible, and don't implement the requirement or the fingerprint itself in the mobile device, because otherwise every mobile app, every developer has to implement it in its own way, and that's something we don't like. And in this example where I said the fingerprint, for example, and the PIN code should be used, make it flexible, make sure you can control it in a configurable way, and enable or disable specific authenticators, in this case the fingerprint, when you detect there's a security threat. Because there are still a lot of security threats at this moment. And Stein will explain a little bit more on that, what you can expect from the security part.
Yeah.
One last thing which is important if you look at requirements and implementing fingerprints, it's about usability. People need to enable or disable the fingerprint very easily. When it's too complex, too many steps in the process, people are not start using it. That's our experience. And in case the fingerprint is not working, for me, example, when sometimes it doesn't work, so it falls back to the PIN code.
When you have wet fingers, for instance.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So you're wet, you need to have your access to your mobile app, and it doesn't work. So fall back to the fingerprint to make sure that people can do the transaction, okay, get into the app itself. Another thing you have to take into account, when people start using the fingerprint and do it quite often, that they sometimes also forget their PIN code. So be aware that you have fallback processes in place to make sure that you can unlock the phone or at least identify the person who is initially enrolled. Because the easier you make it for the people, people start to forget things.
Especially the things they need to remember.
Yeah, and you have the same problem with passwords, and now it starts with PIN codes.
Mm-hmm. Well, PIN codes are easier to remember, but still.
Yeah, that's true. So, but the most important thing, it's very convenient, but you indeed should be aware that that people start forgetting things, and it's getting complexer for them. So when implementing this, take this into account. Stein, maybe it's good you dig in a little bit more on the security threats and how to implement it in a technical way.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. Dennis already mentioned it. Security is really important. And as he already said, there are already a lot of vendors that already implemented the fingerprint authentication. Those vendors also make mistakes. So there are a range of security threats that are already possible on the fingerprint authenticators. We have, I think, all seen the way Apple was the first one who introduced the fingerprint authentication. And we've all seen that the fingerprint scanner could be fooled with a fake fingerprint made out of material that actually conducted electronics. So basically, you need to be aware that these fingerprint authentication can be bypassed or can be hacked or attacked. And we've written down a number of attacks which are possible at the moment and which you need to take into account when implementing the fingerprint authentication. So the confused authorization attack is one of the very interesting ones if you look at the way that it's done. Because if the user just puts his finger on the phone and doesn't know what kind of transaction he's actually approving, then attackers will use this in order to actually fool the user into authorizing something that they actually don't want to do. So it's very important that you always have proof of the transaction that the user is doing on the screen so that the user can actually see what he's giving authorization to or see what he's doing with his fingerprint. So that's something which is really important. The fingerprint database manipulating is something which relates to the vendors having chosen a certain way of implementing their fingerprint authentication. So many of the vendors use a secure element in order to store the fingerprints, etc. But also some of the vendors still lack in the security there. So there are bypasses possible so that the fingerprints could be harvested from a device, and then specifically from a routed device. Also, it's possible to collect fingerprint through malware. As I said, it's also a little bit related to the DB manipulating threat. And so you need to be aware that these fingerprint authentication, it's not a one-stop shop, as in you need to be aware of the risks and of the possible attacks that can be done on this type of authentication. So how did we do it at Onegini? As Denis already explained, we have our own SDK, and that SDK is implemented by the app developers into a mobile application. So the SDK is basically one of the building blocks of an application. So that SDK actually interacts with the Fingerprint API. And the Fingerprint API the Fingerprint API connects with the mobile SDK of Onegini. And the Onegini SDK then talks with the server in order to make sure that this transaction is authentic and is correct. So as Denis already explained, we need to keep an audit trail on the server side in order to see what users actually used the fingerprint and which users, for instance, used the PIN code. And also policy management is a very important part. I will dig a little bit deeper into this later, but basically you want the server to be able to be in control. So the server needs to control what the device can do, because we at Onegini always say that the mobile device is untrusted. So you don't know what kind of device it is, you don't know what the user has done to this device, or you don't know what kind of malware is running on that device. So to dig a little bit deeper into the way that we implemented it. So at the bottom of this slide, you see a picture of the Onegini SDK, and as we already told, that there are a lot of different vendors who implemented their fingerprint API, and as of now, Android is coming with a new version in where they actually standardize the fingerprint API, but at the moment there is no standard for this. So there are a lot of vendors who have their own API and also own possibilities. So actually, what the Onegini SDK does is we actually abstract away all these kind of different APIs that a mobile app developer needs to implement, and the Onegini SDK takes care of that all. So the mobile app developer just has to talk with the Onegini SDK, and the fingerprint authentication can be done. So that's just a really, really important part of this. Another one of the big cornerstones of our security is the PIN code. So we always use the PIN code as a fallback. The reason for this is that we say that there's a real different risk profile based on the fingerprint authentication, as you've already seen, because of the possible attacks and the way the vendors implemented the fingerprint authentication. So we need to have another way of authenticating the user. So maybe in case the fingerprint fails, or in case the policy is not, so the device has too high risk and the policy tells that this user cannot use the fingerprint authentication anymore. So that also means that we implemented the PIN authentication completely detached from the fingerprint authentication. So they can be both done separately from each other. So that's really important to as well to note. So they are not connected in any way to each other.
Maybe like the voice can be attached later on as an extra authenticator for fallback, as I mentioned, because when the fingerprint is hacked, you won't allow people to be using the fingerprint on that device, because then they can easily sign, or someone else can sign the transaction, and that's not the idea. And the voice is still more a trusted way, or a different way.
Yeah, but it's also another thing that a thing that you have, as in you have your voice. And also those authenticators can, of course, be bypassed maybe. And that's
true.
And it's the thing that we say is the organization should be in control, and they should decide on what kind of risks are acceptable. And we as a vendor, we cannot decide for them. Next slide, please. So the policy management, as I already told, it's really important that the server must be in control. And what I mean by that is that the mobile app, there might be all kinds of things happening inside a mobile application or on a mobile device that actually influence the policy. So influence whether the fingerprint authentication can be used or not. For example, some of the influences are jailbreak detection or debug detection. And jailbreak detection is a really important one, we say, because what basically a jailbreak does is you actually remove the normal sandbox that an application is running in. So when a device is jailbroken, you can bypass that normal sandbox, and other applications can access processes, can access data which they normally cannot access. So a jailbroken device is very, very risky. Also, debug detection is something which we leverage, and it's important because you basically want to keep attackers out. So you don't want that attackers are able to investigate your application.
So basically, when the device is jailbreaked, it's much more easier to fake or bypass the fingerprint.
Yeah, definitely, because the attacker then has access to, for instance, the fingerprint database when the vendor has made a few mistakes there, or he's able to steal the fingerprints, or he's able to register his own fake fingerprint into the device so that he can authenticate. So those are things that are really important to note. Also, the OS version and device type, I already mentioned it a little bit. So when there are certain vulnerabilities known for a certain device or certain OS version, we could actually limit or tell, no, this OS version or this device type cannot use the fingerprint authentication because it's too risky. It has a high risk because of a certain vulnerability.
Yeah, maybe if somebody starts implementing the fingerprint itself in the mobile, then you enable it for all the versions for the mobile app itself.
Exactly, you don't have control.
And now you get more control.
Yeah, you actually can decide on when you want to enable or disable the fingerprint authentication. And again, the server is in control. So the server eventually decides whether this fingerprint authentication is allowed or not. So even if the mobile device has been tampered with, still the server decides whether this fingerprint authentication is allowed or not. So then the attacker would also need to influence or need to hack the server. And when he does that, he can already access the data. So yeah, it's really important that the server must be in control. So also other context information, for example, location or times or you name it, can be used in order to build a policy, to build a risk profile of a certain transaction. And the last part is the policy needs to be updated at runtime. So when you detect a threat, you don't want that you need to wait until you can restart the server in order to update the policy. You want to do that at runtime. So when you detect the threat, you immediately want to change the policy of the server. And already the last slide, FIDO support is also very interesting in terms of authenticators. So basically FIDO makes kind of an abstraction layer. So they define a protocol in order to be able to easily interact with a range of authenticators. Basically, the FIDO has also a number of components, the FIDO standard, and the FIDO client and FIDO server are really important there. So in order to be able to leverage FIDO, you need to have both a FIDO client implementation, either inside your app or in your web application. And on the server side, you need to have a FIDO server, which actually registers the authenticators and actually can check whether this authentication is legit and is authentic. So those are important things. And the Onegini SDK supports the FIDO client in order to be able to attach a number of authenticators. For instance, the fingerprint authentication can later on be done through FIDO instead of directly through interacting with all the vendor APIs.
I believe Samsung S6 supports FIDO.
Yeah, the Samsung S6 is the first device with the built-in fingerprint authentication that also supports FIDO. Yeah, but there will be a number of other authenticators coming this year and next year, which support FIDO as well. So that's really important. But when you want to use FIDO, you do need to do a lot of things as well. So it's not that you can just, hey, FIDO is interesting, I will just plug into it. No. It will cost you quite some work in order to implement the FIDO client and FIDO server.
You still need the FIDO server then.
Yeah, and also, but then again, still you need to have the policy in place. Yeah. Otherwise, you can leverage that authenticator, but still you don't have the risk profile.
No. Yeah, so it's an extra component, makes it more flexible. We see a lot of traction on FIDO getting there now. It's not there yet in the sense that everybody supports it, but especially on the authenticator part, you see that people start to support FIDO. So it makes it technically easier to implement, but be aware all the things we mentioned before, integrating your process, take all the proper actions, policy management are still valid and needs to be implemented. So on the server side, we're also going to support the FIDO's part to make it more flexible for the future. Thanks, Stein.
You as well, Denis.
Yeah, so we come to the end of this webinar. If there are any questions, you can definitely do it through the chat question box. So I would like to thank everybody for joining this webinar. We will send you the link when the webinar is ready and will be sent online. If later on you have any questions or would like to dig a little bit more on specific items, don't hesitate to send an email or contact us. Okay, thanks for your time and have a nice day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.